The world's most advanced reactor failed for 6 weeks straight, until a billionaire CEO mocked a cleaning lady, and her 11-year-old daughter heard the one sound every computer in the room had missed. At 2:17 a.m., the Orion Dynamics Research Facility glowed like a lighthouse in the quiet outskirts of San Diego. Inside Lab 7, the lights were still burning. They had been burning almost every night for 6 weeks. Victor Langford stood alone behind the glass observation wall, with arms folded, staring at the machine that had begun to feel less like a scientific breakthrough and more like a personal insult. In the center of the lab floor stood the Helios reactor prototype, a cylinder of polished titanium nearly 3 meters tall. Its surface reflected the sterile laboratory lights in cold silver curves. Dozens of cables fed into its base like veins feeding a restless heart. The machine represented 10 years of work, $2.4 billion, and the future of Orion Dynamics. If it worked, Victor would change the energy industry forever. If it didn't, he didn't allow himself to finish that thought. Behind him, a dozen engineers stared at glowing monitors. Lines of data slid endlessly across their screens. Vibration readings, thermal curves, electromagnetic fluctuations. The brightest minds Victor could hire had been studying those numbers for weeks. And still the same problem remained. Always the same. One of the engineers glanced at the countdown timer. Starting test sequence. The room quieted. The reactor hummed softly as its internal systems awakened. Cooling pumps spun to life. Magnetic stabilizers began their slow rhythm. Victor watched the timer begin. 10 seconds. The Helios reactor emitted a deep, steady vibration that filled the lab like distant thunder. 20 seconds. Dr. Naomi Carter leaned closer to her monitor, studying the frequency graphs. 30 seconds. So far, and everything looked normal. Victor's jaw tightened. He'd seen this before. Every single night. 50 seconds. Still stable. A ripple of cautious hope passed through the engineers. 60 seconds. Victor didn't move. 70 seconds. Dr. Carter's brow furrowed. Something flickered on the vibration graph. 80 seconds. The machine began to tremble, barely visible, but unmistakable. Victor exhaled slowly. He already knew what was coming. The timer reached 87 seconds. A sharp metallic vibration snapped through the reactor's core. Then, silence. The Helios reactor shut down instantly. The lab lights seemed colder after the machine stopped humming. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, one engineer rubbed his face in exhaustion. "Same failure point," he muttered. Victor turned away from the glass. 6 weeks, dozens of tests, hundreds of diagnostic models, and still the reactor collapsed at exactly 87 seconds every time. It didn't make sense. Well, that was the part Victor hated most. Machines were supposed to follow rules, but this one behaved like it had a secret. Behind him, someone sighed. Another engineer leaned back in his chair. "We've checked every sensor. We rebuilt the control algorithm. We even replaced the coolant assembly." Victor felt irritation creeping under his calm expression. "You're telling me," he said quietly, "that the most advanced energy reactor on the planet is being defeated by a problem no one in this room can even identify?" No one answered. Silence spread through the lab like a stain. Victor's eyes drifted toward the far end of the room. A woman in a grey uniform pushed a cleaning cart slowly along the polished floor. She moved carefully, quietly, as if she had spent years perfecting the art of being unnoticed. Her name was Eleanor Cruz. Victor had seen her many nights before. Or the night crew cleaned the building after midnight. Usually he never paid attention, But tonight the tension in the room sharpened his temper, and suddenly an idea, cruel, careless, born entirely from frustration, formed in his mind. Victor gestured toward the woman. "Maybe we're approaching this the wrong way." The engineers looked confused. Victor's voice carried across the lab. "Maybe we need fresh eyes." The woman froze slightly. "Weeks." Eleanor looked uncomfortable. "Weeks." Eleanor looked uncomfortable. "I just cleaned the floors, sir." Victor spread his hands toward the silent reactor. "Well," he said lightly, "maybe you see something my engineers don't." A few tired engineers chuckled. It was an ugly sound. Eleanor lowered her eyes. "Oh, I wouldn't know anything about that." Victor stepped closer to the glass wall. "Come on," he said, half mocking now. "Take a look. If you can fix the reactor, I'll give you $100 million. The room erupted with laughter. Elena's face flushed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I can't help." And then a small voice spoke from the open lab doorway. Clear, calm, unexpected. "My mom can't fix it." Every head in the room turned. An 11-year-old girl stood there, her holding the strap of a worn backpack. Her dark eyes studied the silent Helios reactor with quiet curiosity. Then she said something that would change every life in that laboratory. "But I think I can." And suddenly, the room that had been filled with laughter fell completely still because of what happened next. For a moment, no one in the laboratory moved. The quiet that followed the girl's words was not the peaceful silence of night. It was the heavy kind of silence that appears when something unexpected has just shifted the air in a room. Victor Langford slowly turned toward the doorway. The girl stood there with a small backpack slung over one shoulder, the straps frayed from years of use. Her dark hair was tied loosely behind her head, and her sneakers looked like they had walked many more miles than most children's shoes ever should. She did not look frightened. She looked curious. Victor studied her for a long moment before speaking. "And you are?" he asked. The girl stepped forward a few cautious steps into the laboratory. "My name is Lily," she said. Her voice was steady. "Lily Cruz." Behind her, Eleanor Cruz had gone completely pale. "Lily," she said quickly, rushing toward her daughter. "What are you doing here?" Lily looked up at her mother. "You said you'd be working late tonight," she explained softly. "The neighbor couldn't watch me anymore, so I walked here." Elena looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said to Victor. "I'll take her home right away." Victor raised a hand slightly. "No," he said. He looked back at the girl. "You said something interesting." The engineers nearby exchanged amused glances. Victor leaned lightly against the railing overlooking the lab floor. "You said you could fix it." Lily shook her head. "No." The engineers chuckled again. Victor raised an eyebrow. "But you just told us you could." Lily pointed toward the reactor. "I said I think I can." The distinction amused Victor more than it should have. There was something strange about the girl's calmness. Children usually looked overwhelmed inside a room like this. Rows of screens, armed security, engineers with doctorates from the best universities in the world. But Lily didn't seem intimidated. She was staring at the Helios reactor the way someone might stare at an unfamiliar animal. Not afraid, just studying it. Victor crossed his arms. "You understand that machine is worth more than the building you're standing in?" Lily nodded slowly. "Yeah." The engineers laughed again. Victor glanced back at Elena. "You bring your daughter to work often?" "No, sir," Elena said quickly. "Never. Tonight was just—" Victor waved it away. His irritation from the failed test still lingered in his chest. 6 weeks of sleepless nights. 6 weeks of watching the reactor collapse at exactly 87 seconds. 6 weeks of the most brilliant engineers he could hire telling him they were close to solving the problem. But they were never close. They were just tired. Victor looked down at Lily again. "So," he said, "tell me something." The girl met his gaze without hesitation. "Okay." Victor gestured toward the silent reactor. "Do you know what that machine does?" Lily tilted her head. "Oh, it makes energy." Victor smirked. "That's a simplified version." She shrugged. "Simple things are usually the right ones." A few engineers exchanged amused looks again. Victor found himself smiling despite his mood. "All right," he said. Then his voice sharpened slightly. "Let's say I take your suggestion seriously." Eleanor immediately shook her head. "No, sir. Please. She's just a child." Victor raised a finger. "I made a bet earlier." The room quieted. Victor's voice carried clearly through the lab. "I said if someone here fixed the reactor, I'd give them $100 million. Several engineers chuckled again. It had been a joke. Everyone knew it. Victor turned back toward Lily. "Well?" Lily didn't react to the number. Instead, she asked a question. "Can I hear it?" Victor blinked. "Hear what?" "The machine." Victor glanced toward Dr. Naomi Carter. She had been watching the girl carefully since she walked in. "Doctor," Carter spoke quietly. "She wants the reactor powered." Victor frowned slightly. "That machine shuts down violently every time we start it." Lily shrugged. "I only need a few seconds." Dr. Carter leaned closer to Victor. "She might notice something we haven't." Victor gave her a skeptical look. "She's 11. "Yes," Dr. Carter said calmly. "But sometimes people who don't know the rules see the problems those rules hide." Victor stared at the reactor again. $2.4 billion. 6 weeks of failure. And now he was standing in a lab full of engineers while a cleaning lady's daughter asked to listen to the machine. The situation would have sounded ridiculous anywhere else. But tonight... Victor exhaled slowly. "Fine." He looked toward the control desk. "Run a 10-second startup." The engineers looked surprised. "Sir?" "Just 10 seconds." Reluctantly, the control engineer activated the console again. The Helios reactor stirred to life once more. Deep within its titanium shell, turbines began spinning. Cooling systems roared softly. The lab filled with the low vibration of enormous mechanical energy waking from sleep. Lily stepped closer to the glass observation barrier. She closed her eyes. The vibration of the reactor filled the room. For several seconds, she didn't move at all. Victor watched her curiously. The engineers watched their monitors, but Lily wasn't watching anything. Oh, she was listening. Then suddenly, "Stop." Her eyes opened. The control engineer shut down the reactor. Silence returned to the room. Victor looked down at the girl. "Well?" Lily pointed toward the reactor. "There's a second sound." The engineers frowned. "What sound?" one asked. Lily hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's like something tapping inside the vibration." Dr. Carter turned quickly toward her monitoring station. She pulled up the raw acoustic feed from the reactor sensors. The screen filled with waveform graphs. Victor leaned closer. Dr. Carter adjusted the filters. Most of the data smoothed into a steady pattern. But then, a tiny spike appeared. Small, almost invisible, but unmistakable. Dr. Carter's eyes widened slightly. Victor looked at the graph. "What is that?" Dr. Carter whispered something that made the entire room go quiet. "That," she said slowly, "it shouldn't be there." And for the first time in 6 weeks, someone in the room began to wonder if the answer to the reactor's failure had been hiding in a sound no one thought to listen for, which led Victor to ask the one question that would change everything. For several seconds after Dr. Naomi Carter spoke, no one in the laboratory said a word. The waveform still glowed on the monitor, and a thin blue line representing the reactor's vibration pattern stretched across the screen like a quiet heartbeat. But embedded inside it, almost invisible unless you zoomed in, was a sharp spike, a sound that did not belong. Victor Langford stared at the graph. Zoom in. Dr. Carter adjusted the scale. The spike became clearer, still small, still easy to dismiss, but now unmistakably real. Victor felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Hope. He turned slowly toward Lily. "You heard that?" Lily nodded. "It was tapping." One of the engineers frowned. "That's impossible," he said. "The system runs harmonic dampeners. There's no mechanical tapping inside the core." Lily looked back at the silent reactor. "I didn't say it was tapping," she said. The engineer crossed his arms. "You literally just said that." Lily shook her head. "I said it sounds like tapping." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Oh, what's the difference?" The girl thought for a moment before answering. "My grandpa used to say machines talk," she explained. The room grew quiet again. "He repaired trains," she continued. "Old diesel engines mostly. When I stayed with him after school, I used to sit in the workshop." Victor folded his arms. And engines don't just break," Lily said softly. "They start whispering first." Several engineers exchanged skeptical looks, but Lily walked closer to the glass barrier again. She studied the reactor like someone studying a strange animal. "Grandpa would make me close my eyes," she said. "He'd run the engine and ask me what I heard." Victor asked almost without thinking, "What did you hear?" "Everything." The girl's answer was simple. The belts, the pistons, the fans, the vibration through the floor. She tapped the glass lightly with one finger. And when something was wrong, "It didn't sound louder." She paused. "It sounded different." Dr. Carter turned slowly from the monitor. "What kind of different?" Lily hesitated. "Like two sounds trying to be the same sound." The engineers frowned again. Victor didn't. Something about the way the girl described it felt strangely precise. Dr. Carter looked back at the waveform. "That spike we detected," she said quietly, "is outside the reactor's main vibration frequency." Victor leaned closer. "More meaning?" "It's a secondary resonance." Victor's eyes narrowed. "That shouldn't exist." "No," Dr. Carter agreed. "It shouldn't." She began pulling up additional sensor feeds. Thermal imaging, stress monitoring, magnetic stabilization curves. Every screen showed the same conclusion. The reactor's systems were functioning perfectly, and yet something inside the machine was creating a vibration that did not belong. Victor turned to Lily again. "What exactly did you hear?" Lily pointed toward the lower half of the reactor. "There." Several engineers glanced toward the titanium shell. "That's the coolant assembly," one of them said. "It's sealed." Another engineer shook his head. "There's nothing inside that section except the stabilizing bolts." Victor looked toward Dr. Carter. "What do you think?" Dr. Carter didn't answer immediately. She was still staring at the waveform. Then she turned slowly toward the reactor.
Run another 10 seconds,
she said. The control engineer looked uncertain. Dr. Carter? 10 seconds, she repeated calmly. Victor nodded. Do it. The reactor roared to life again. Deep vibrations filled the laboratory. The floor hummed softly beneath everyone's feet. Lily closed her eyes once more. Victor watched her carefully this time. Her breathing slowed. Her head tilted slightly. The reactor continued running. 5 seconds, 7 seconds, 9 seconds.
Stop!
The machine shut down again. Lily opened her eyes. Victor stepped closer. Well? The girl walked along the glass observation barrier until she stood directly across from a cluster of large titanium bolts near the reactor's cooling ring. She pointed. There. An engineer immediately shook his head. That section's solid metal. There's no moving part there. Lily shrugged. Something's moving. Victor turned toward Dr. Carter. Oh, she was already pulling up another diagnostic layer. Let's isolate the vibration data around the coolant ring, she said. The system processed the request. For several seconds, the computers ran through millions of calculations. Then the screen refreshed, and the room went silent again. The vibration pattern near the coolant assembly looked completely different from the rest of the reactor. Tiny distortions rippled through the frequency line. Dr. Carter leaned closer. Magnify that. The image sharpened, and there it was, a microscopic irregularity in the vibration curve. Victor felt his pulse quicken. What does that mean? Dr. Carter spoke slowly. It means something inside that section is under stress. One engineer shook his head. That's impossible. Victor turned sharply. Why? Because that component is forged from reinforced aerospace alloy. The engineer gestured toward the reactor. That metal doesn't crack. Victor's voice dropped slightly. Everything cracks. He looked at Lily again. What do you think is happening inside my reactor? Lily studied the machine quietly. Then she said something that made several engineers laugh out loud. I think one of the bolts is tired. The laughter echoed through the laboratory. But Victor Langford didn't laugh, because for the first time in 6 weeks, someone in the room had suggested a problem no computer model had even considered, which forced Victor to make the most dangerous decision of the entire experiment. The laughter faded slowly through the laboratory. At first it sounded harmless, just tired engineers reacting to the strange confidence of a child. But beneath that laughter was something else. Doubt. Victor Langford stood with his arms folded, eyes fixed on the Helios reactor. A bolt is tired. It sounded absurd. $2.4 billion in research. The most advanced energy prototype ever built. Hundreds of sensors. Supercomputer diagnostics. And the possible explanation was a bolt that had become tired. One of the engineers shook his head, still smiling. That's not how metallurgy works. Another added, the coolant assembly is built with aerospace-grade titanium alloy. Stress fractures would show up in the structural sensors immediately. Victor didn't answer. He was still looking at the reactor. 6 weeks. 6 weeks of failures at exactly 87 seconds. 6 weeks of perfect data and useless explanations. And now, a cleaning lady's daughter had heard something no instrument had reported clearly. Victor turned slowly toward Dr. Naomi Carter. You're the materials expert, he said. What's your opinion? Dr. Carter didn't respond right away. Her eyes were fixed on the vibration graphs still glowing across the monitors. Yet then she leaned forward and zoomed deeper into the distortion pattern Lily had pointed out. A thin ripple passed through the waveform again, not large, not dramatic, but precise, too precise to be random. Dr. Carter exhaled slowly. Metal fatigue doesn't always show up in surface diagnostics, she said. The engineers looked at her. She continued, if the stress is microscopic and located under a bolt head, the sensors could filter it out as background noise. Victor nodded once. Oh, so the girl might be right. Several engineers shifted uncomfortably. One of them spoke. With respect, we'd have to partially dismantle the coolant ring to inspect that section. Victor's eyes didn't leave the reactor. How long? 4 hours at least. Risk? The engineer hesitated. Any time you open a reactor housing, you risk damaging the alignment. Dr. Carter added quietly, if we're wrong, we lose at least 2 days recalibrating the system. Victor considered the machine again. Helios reactor. 10 years of development. Every investor watching. Every competitor waiting for Orion Dynamics to fail. And right now, the only lead they had came from an 11-year-old girl. Victor turned to Lily. Why that bolt? He asked. Lily shrugged slightly. It sounded lonely. The engineers looked confused. Victor raised an eyebrow. Lonely? Everything else in the machine vibrates together, Lily explained. But that one sound was out of rhythm. She tapped her fingers lightly against the glass, like someone clapping off beat. Dr. Carter's eyes flickered with interest. Victor noticed. You agree with her? Dr. Carter chose her words carefully. I agree that the vibration anomaly originates from the coolant ring. Victor took a slow breath. Then he made the decision. Open it. The engineers blinked. Oh, sir. Victor's voice sharpened. You heard me. But if the alignment shifts... Victor cut him off. Open it. The room suddenly came alive. Technicians moved quickly toward the reactor floor. Tool carts rolled across the polished surface. Safety protocols lit up across the monitors. Above it all, Lily watched silently from beside her mother. Elena squeezed her daughter's shoulder. You shouldn't have said anything, she whispered nervously. Lily didn't answer. Her eyes remained fixed on the reactor. Below them, engineers began removing the outer coolant ring casing. Heavy titanium panels were carefully lifted away. Inside the exposed chamber, a circle of reinforced bolts held the cooling structure in place. Dr. Carter leaned over the railing beside Victor. Let's see if your young consultant is right. Victor didn't respond. Minutes passed as technicians worked carefully. Finally, one engineer called out. Oh, fiber camera ready? A thin inspection cable slid into the narrow space beneath the bolt cluster Lily had pointed at. The camera's feed appeared on the central monitor. At first, the image showed nothing unusual. Smooth metal, clean edges, perfect engineering. One engineer folded his arms smugly. See? Dr. Carter leaned closer. Zoom in. The image magnified. Still nothing. The engineer smiled. Told you? Dr. Carter wasn't satisfied. Well, increase magnification again. The system adjusted. The image sharpened further, and suddenly something appeared. A line, so thin it was almost invisible, but unmistakable. A crack, barely 1 millimeter long, hidden beneath the head of the bolt. For several seconds, the room fell completely silent. Then someone whispered, no way. Victor stepped closer to the screen. The crack glowed faintly under the thermal filter. Dr. Carter spoke quietly. Oh, that's it. Victor's voice was low. That tiny thing is shutting down my reactor. Dr. Carter nodded. At high-frequency rotation, the crack creates a harmonic resonance cascade. She turned toward the engineers. The system isn't failing because the reactor is unstable. She pointed to the crack. It's failing because that vibration grows stronger every second. Victor glanced at the timer display on the wall. 87 seconds. Exactly when the resonance would peak. But he turned slowly toward Lily. You found that by listening? Lily nodded, but she didn't look proud. She looked thoughtful. Victor folded his arms again. All right, he said, if that's the problem. He studied the exposed coolant ring. How do we fix it? The engineers began discussing replacement procedures immediately, but Lily spoke again before anyone could decide. You shouldn't replace it. Everyone turned. Victor frowned slightly. Why not? Lily looked at the crack on the screen. Because it will just happen again. Victor raised an eyebrow. And you know that how? The girl pointed at the vibration graph still glowing on the monitor. The machine isn't too weak, she said quietly. It's too strong. The room fell silent once more. And Victor Langford realized the little girl wasn't just hearing problems in his reactor. She might already know how to solve them, which made everyone in the room wait for the answer she would give next. For several seconds after Lily spoke, no one in the laboratory said anything. The crack still glowed faintly on the monitor, a fracture barely the width of a human hair. Yet it had stopped a machine built by some of the most advanced engineers in the world. Victor Langford slowly turned toward the girl. You're saying replacing the bolt won't solve the problem? Lily nodded. It'll break again. One of the engineers shook his head immediately. That's speculation. Dr. Carter crossed her arms thoughtfully. Not necessarily. Victor looked between them. Explain. Dr. Carter stepped closer to the monitor displaying the vibration graphs. The reactor operates at extremely high rotational frequencies, she said. If the structure produces harmonic resonance at a specific point in the assembly, any replacement bolt would experience the same stress. She gestured toward the crack. It might take longer to fail, but eventually... Victor finished the thought quietly. It breaks again. Dr. Carter nodded. Yes. The engineers began murmuring among themselves. One of them spoke up. But we designed the assembly with dampening tolerances, Dr. Carter replied calmly. Those tolerances assume uniform vibration. She pointed toward the spike Lily had detected earlier. This vibration isn't uniform. Victor looked back at Lily. And you believe the machine is too strong? Lily shrugged. That's what it sounds like. The engineers exchanged confused looks again. Victor crouched slightly so he could look at her at eye level. All right, he said. Pretend I know nothing about machines. Lily smiled faintly. Okay. Victor pointed toward the reactor.
Explain what's happening!
The girl thought for a moment. When a machine spins really fast, she said slowly, everything inside it tries to move together. Victor nodded. So far, that's correct. But sometimes, Lily continued, one tiny part moves a little differently. Dr. Carter watched her closely. Lily tapped her fingers lightly against the railing. When that happens, the machine starts pushing against itself. Victor's brow furrowed. Dr. Carter whispered almost to herself. Resonance conflict, Lily continued. It's like when people walk across a bridge. Victor blinked. A bridge? She nodded. If everyone steps at the same time, the bridge starts shaking. Dr. Carter turned toward Victor. That's actually a classic resonance example. Victor looked back at Lily. So, what's happening inside my reactor? Lily pointed toward the bolt again. That piece is getting pushed at the wrong rhythm. Victor studied the crack on the monitor. And that pressure makes it fail. Yes. Victor stood again. Then we strengthen the part. Lily shook her head. No. The engineers laughed again. You literally just said it's too weak, one of them said. Lily didn't argue. She simply pointed at the graph. If you make it stronger, the vibration will push harder. Victor folded his arms. Then what's the alternative? Lily looked back at the machine. Her eyes moved slowly along the reactor's structure. Then she said something that made the entire engineering team stare at her in disbelief. You make it softer. Victor blinked. Softer? Yes. One engineer chuckled. That's the opposite of structural reinforcement. Lily nodded. I know. Dr. Carter leaned forward. Wait. The room quieted again. Dr. Carter's eyes moved between the crack and the vibration graph. Then she looked at Lily. You're suggesting vibration absorption? Lily shrugged. Grandpa used rubber mounts on train engines. Victor turned toward Dr. Carter. Would that work? Dr. Carter hesitated. In principle? Yes. The engineers looked shocked. That's not possible, one protested. The reactor core operates at temperatures exceeding 800 degrees. Rubber would melt instantly. Dr. Carter nodded. Rubber would? Victor narrowed his eyes. But another material might not. Dr. Carter looked back at the bolt cluster. If we introduced a softer metal sleeve between the bolt and the housing... She paused. It could absorb the resonance vibration. Victor felt a spark of excitement rise in his chest. What metal? Dr. Carter answered immediately. Copper. The engineers stared. Copper? One said. That's far softer than titanium. Exactly, Dr. Carter replied. Victor turned toward Lily again. So, instead of fighting the vibration... Lily finished the thought quietly. You let it breathe. The laboratory grew silent again. Victor walked slowly toward the observation glass. He stared at the massive Helios reactor. For the first time since the project began, the problem felt understandable. Not a mysterious failure, not an invisible error, just physics. Simple physics that everyone in the room had overlooked. Victor turned back toward the engineers. How long to fabricate a copper sleeve? One technician spoke carefully. If we machine it precisely, maybe 3 hours. Victor didn't hesitate. Start now. The room burst into motion again. Technicians rushed toward the fabrication lab. Dr. Carter began recalculating resonance tolerances, and for the first time in 6 weeks, the Helios reactor had a real solution. Victor glanced down at Lily once more. You might have just saved this project. Lily looked back at the machine. I haven't saved it yet. Victor smiled slightly. No, he said. Yeah, but you just gave us a chance. And somewhere deep inside the Orion Dynamics facility, the machines that had failed for 42 nights in a row were about to face one final test. A test that would decide whether the little girl's impossible idea could truly save the reactor. By the time the fabrication lab doors sealed behind the engineers, it was already past 3 in the morning. The Orion Dynamics facility had the strange quiet that only very large buildings possess at night, a quiet that seemed to hum with electricity and distant machines even when no one was speaking. Victor Langford remained at the observation railing overlooking the reactor floor. Below him, the Helios reactor stood half dismantled beneath the bright surgical lights of the lab. Panels had been removed. Tool carts surrounded the base like metal islands in a white sea of polished floor. A resonance model confirms Lily's resonance model confirms Lily's observation, she said. Victor glanced at the screen. What kind of reduction are we expecting? If the copper sleeve absorbs the harmonic vibration correctly, Dr. Carter replied. The stress cascade should collapse before it reaches critical amplitude. Victor exhaled slowly. In English? The reactor might finally survive past 87 seconds. Victor allowed himself the smallest smile. Across the room, Eleanor sat in a chair beside the wall, arms wrapped protectively around Lily. The girl had not spoken much since the engineers began working. She simply watched the reactor. Victor studied her for a moment. Children usually fell asleep at this hour, but Lily looked more awake than anyone in the room. Victor walked toward them. You should both probably go home, he said gently. Eleanor nodded nervously. Yes, sir. I was just thinking the same. Lily interrupted softly. I want to see if it works. Victor hesitated. No, you might be waiting a while. That's okay. There was something about the way she said it that reminded Victor of the engineers he respected most. People who could sit beside a machine for hours simply because they wanted to understand it. He nodded once. All right. Back in the fabrication lab, the copper sleeve was already taking shape. A solid bar of copper rotated slowly on the precision lathe as cutting tools shaved away thin glowing ribbons of metal. He, the machine operator, watched the measurements carefully, adjusting the blade by fractions of a millimeter. The sleeve had to be perfect. Too tight, and the vibration would still transfer through the bolt. Too loose, and the reactor alignment could destabilize. 3 hours of machining passed slowly. Inside Lab 7, the engineers moved with careful focus. At 4:42 a.m., the fabrication lab doors opened again. The copper sleeve rested in a padded container. Under the bright lights, its polished surface gleamed with a warm, reddish glow that contrasted sharply against the cold titanium of the reactor. Victor picked it up carefully. This little thing might save $2 billion, he murmured. Dr. Carter corrected him quietly. 2.4. Victor chuckled faintly. Right. Technicians moved quickly now. The damaged bolt was removed. All the cracked metal beneath it looked even smaller than it had on the screen, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Victor felt a strange respect for the tiny fracture. Such a small imperfection. Yet it had defeated the best engineers in the world. The copper sleeve slid into position. Then the replacement bolt tightened slowly into place. Torque sensors beeped softly as the engineers locked it down to exact specifications. One technician stepped back. Installation complete. Dr. Carter checked the vibration alignment readings. Stabilizers recalibrated. Victor looked toward the control desk. Prepare for test. A ripple of tension passed through the room. Everyone knew what this moment meant. 42 failed attempts. 42 nights ending in silence at exactly 87 seconds. Now, there would be one more. Victor glanced at Lily. She had moved closer to the observation glass again. Her hands rested quietly on the railing. Victor walked to the center of the lab floor microphone. Final startup sequence, he announced. The control engineer nodded. Beginning ignition. The Helios reactor awakened once more. Low vibrations rolled through the laboratory like distant thunder. The timer appeared on the central display. 10 seconds. The machine hummed steadily. 20 seconds. Dr. Carter studied the vibration graphs carefully. 30 seconds. All readings stable. Victor felt his pulse quicken. 40 seconds. Still stable. No unusual spikes. 50 seconds. The engineers leaned closer to their monitors. 60 seconds. Victor's hands tightened slightly against the railing. For 6 weeks, the machine had never reached 90 seconds. 70 seconds. Dr. Carter whispered quietly, resonance levels dropping. Victor stared at the timer. 80 seconds. The room was silent now. Even the engineers had stopped breathing. 84 seconds. Victor felt the familiar tension building. 86 seconds. The moment that had ended every test before. 87 seconds. The reactor continued running. No vibration spike. No metallic snap. Just the steady hum of energy. For several seconds, no one moved. Then the timer passed 90 seconds. A collective gasp swept through the lab. But the reactor kept running. 95 seconds. 100 seconds. The Helios reactor was still alive. And in that moment, every person in the room realized the impossible idea of an 11-year-old girl had just done what the world's greatest engineers could not, which led Victor Langford to face a promise he had made without ever expecting it to become real. For a moment, after the timer crossed 100 seconds, the laboratory remained frozen in disbelief. The Helios reactor continued to hum. A deep, steady vibration filled the room, not violent, not unstable, but smooth, controlled, alive. Victor Langford didn't move. He simply stared at the display above the reactor. 105 seconds, 110 seconds. The number climbed higher with each passing heartbeat. Around him, the engineers looked at one another as if they were waking from a strange dream. Then Dr. Naomi Carter spoke quietly. Resonance cascade has collapsed. Her eyes scanned the monitors rapidly. All vibration levels stable. Victor finally allowed himself to breathe. Keep it running, he said. The control engineer nodded. Thermal levels nominal. Magnetic containment stable. The reactor continued its steady rhythm. 120 seconds. 130 seconds. Someone in the room laughed softly. It wasn't mocking laughter this time. It was relief. Weeks of exhaustion, frustration, and doubt were suddenly dissolving in the quiet success of a machine that was finally behaving the way it was supposed to. Victor turned slowly toward Lily. She was still standing at the observation glass. All room stepped aside as he crossed toward the girl. Eleanor looked nervous again. Sir, she didn't mean to. Victor raised a hand gently. It's all right. He stopped in front of Lily. For a moment, the billionaire CEO of Orion Dynamics simply looked at the 11-year-old girl who had solved a problem worth billions of dollars. Then Victor did something that shocked everyone in the laboratory. He knelt. The room went silent again. Victor Langford rarely knelt for anyone, yet here he was, lowering himself to the height of a child. You just saved my reactor, he said quietly. Lily tilted her head. It wasn't broken, she said. Victor smiled faintly. No, he agreed. It was misunderstood. Behind him, the engineers watched the exchange in stunned silence. Victor stood again and turned toward the control desk. Shut down the reactor. The engineer hesitated. Sir, the test is still running. I know. Victor looked back at the machine. We've proven what we needed to prove. The shutdown sequence began. Slowly, the deep vibration of the reactor faded until the lab returned to silence. But this silence felt very different from the ones before. This silence held victory. Victor turned back toward Lily and Elena. I made a promise earlier tonight. Eleanor looked confused. A promise? Victor nodded. I said that if someone fixed the reactor, I would give them $100 million. Several engineers shifted uncomfortably. They remembered the moment clearly. The laughter, the cruel joke. None of them had believed the words would ever matter. Victor reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Elena immediately shook her head. No, sir, that was just a joke. Please don't. Victor interrupted her gently. No. His voice was calm now. But I keep my word. He handed the phone to Dr. Carter. Contact legal. Dr. Carter blinked. Victor, create a trust fund, he continued. $100 million. The room went completely still again. For Lily Cruz. Eleanor's eyes widened in disbelief. That's not necessary. Victor looked at her kindly. Maybe not. Then he looked down at Lily. But fair is fair. Lily didn't react the way Victor expected. She didn't look excited. She didn't look shocked. She simply asked a question. What's a trust fund? Several engineers laughed quietly. Victor smiled. It's money that will make sure you can learn anything you want for the rest of your life. Lily thought about that for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. That sounds useful. Victor chuckled softly, but as the laughter faded, he found himself studying the girl more closely. There was something unusual about her calmness. Most children would have been overwhelmed. But Lily seemed more interested in the machine than the money. Victor leaned slightly closer. Tell me something, he said. Okay. Who taught you to listen to machines like that? Lily answered without hesitation. My grandpa. Victor nodded. Your grandfather must be a very good mechanic. Lily looked down at the floor for a moment. Then she said something that made Victor's smile fade. He was. Victor felt a small uneasiness stir in his chest. Was? Lily looked back up. He died last year. Victor's voice softened. I'm sorry. Lily shrugged slightly. He fixed airplanes before he died. Victor felt something strange tighten in his chest. Airplanes? Lily nodded. Military ones. Victor stared at her. What was his name? The girl answered simply, Miguel Cruz. And in that moment, Victor Langford felt the world shift beneath his feet, because that was the name of a man his family had never forgotten. For several seconds after Lily spoke the name, Victor Langford did not move. The laboratory around him was still alive with quiet celebration. Engineers were congratulating one another. Technicians were documenting the successful test. And somewhere across the room, someone had begun explaining the copper sleeve solution into a recorder for the official project log. But Victor heard none of it. Miguel Cruz. The name moved slowly through his mind like an old memory unlocking a door that had been closed for decades. Victor looked down at Lily again. Did you say Miguel Cruz? Lily nodded. That's my grandpa. Victor felt a strange weight settle in his chest. He turned slightly toward Elena. Your father? Eleanor shook her head. My husband's father, she said. He raised my husband. Victor stared at the reactor floor for a moment. Then he spoke quietly. Was he an aircraft mechanic? Elena blinked in surprise. Yes. Victor's voice dropped even lower. Did he work for the Air Force? Elena nodded again, now clearly confused. How did you know that? Victor didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the far wall of the laboratory where a framed photograph hung among several historical images from Orion Dynamics' early aerospace projects. Most people never noticed that photograph, and it showed a damaged bomber plane resting on a runway, surrounded by mechanics. Victor had seen it thousands of times, but now he saw it differently. Slowly, he walked across the lab. Lily followed him with curious eyes. Victor stopped in front of the photograph and gestured toward it. Do you know what this is? Lily shook her head. No. Victor studied the faded image. This aircraft belonged to the 214th Bomber Squadron during the Gulf War. Several engineers nearby fell quiet as they realized Victor had begun telling a story he had never shared inside the lab before. My grandfather was the pilot of that aircraft. Lily looked closer at the picture. What happened to it? Victor smiled faintly. The engine exploded during a mission over the ocean. Eleanor gasped softly. Victor continued. The plane barely made it back to base. He pointed toward the group of mechanics in the photograph. The Air Force engineers inspected the damage and said the aircraft would never fly again. Victor's voice grew softer. But one mechanic disagreed. He leaned closer to the image. He said the damage looked worse than it actually was. Victor paused. That mechanic worked through the night. The laboratory was completely silent now. He rebuilt the engine mount by hand. Rebalanced the turbine assembly. Replaced several damaged supports. Victor tapped the frame lightly. And by morning, the aircraft flew again. Lily studied the photo carefully. What was the mechanic's name? Victor looked down at her. Miguel Cruz. Elena covered her mouth. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Victor nodded slowly. Yes. Lily's eyes widened. My grandpa? Victor nodded again. He saved my grandfather's life. The weight of that realization settled into the room like gravity. Victor took a slow breath. My family has told that story for 30 years. He looked back toward Lily. We never knew what happened to him after that. Eleanor finally found her voice. My husband passed away 5 years ago, she said quietly. Victor's expression softened. I'm sorry. Eleanor nodded. My father-in-law lived with us after that. Oh, he fixed small machines in the garage. Victor smiled faintly. That sounds like him. Lily looked from Victor to the photograph again. So, my grandpa fixed your grandpa's airplane? Victor nodded. Yes. Lily thought about that for a moment. Then she said something simple that made several engineers smile. That means we're even. Victor laughed quietly. No, he said. We're not even. He gestured toward the silent Helios reactor. Tonight your family saved mine again. The room grew quiet once more. Victor looked down at Lily. You didn't just fix a machine tonight. He paused. You finished a story my family has been telling for 3 decades. Lily looked thoughtful. I just listened to the machine? Victor smiled gently. Yes. Then he glanced toward the reactor again. But sometimes that's how the world changes. The Helios reactor stood silently in the center of the laboratory. Well, for weeks it had been a symbol of failure. Now it had become something else entirely. A reminder that brilliance doesn't always come from titles or degrees. Sometimes it comes from people who simply know how to listen. Victor looked at Lily one more time. You know, he said softly, There's still one thing I don't understand. Lily tilted her head. What? Victor gestured toward the massive machine behind them. How did you hear something that every computer in this building missed? Lily thought about the question carefully. Then she answered in the same calm voice she had used all night. Because computers don't know what silence sounds like. And that simple answer would stay with Victor Langford long after the laboratory lights went dark, because the morning that followed would change all of their lives in ways none of them had yet imagined. The sun rose slowly over the Orion Dynamics campus. Yeah, for most of the engineers who had worked through the night, morning arrived without ceremony. Coffee cups littered the desks. Screens still glowed with data logs from the successful reactor test. The building smelled faintly of warm electronics and exhaustion, but inside Lab 7, something had changed. The Helios reactor stood quietly in the center of the room, its titanium surface reflecting the pale gold of early sunlight streaming through the high windows. Oh, for 6 weeks it had been the enemy. Now it looked almost peaceful. Victor Langford had not gone home. He stood alone in the observation area, watching technicians carefully reinstall the reactor's exterior panels. Every bolt was tightened with surgical precision, every sensor recalibrated. Behind him, the engineers spoke in excited, low voices. The test data from the night before was already spreading through Orion Dynamics like wildfire. Emails had begun arriving from investors. Messages from the board. Even the Department of Energy had requested a briefing. Victor barely noticed. His attention kept drifting toward the small seating area near the lab entrance. Lily Cruz sat there quietly, her backpack resting beside her chair. Elena had fallen asleep leaning against the wall, exhaustion finally catching up with her after the long night. But Lily was awake. She watched the reactor the way a child might watch waves rolling across the ocean, calm, curious, patient. Victor walked over and sat in the chair beside her. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked. Lily shook her head. "I wasn't tired." Victor smiled faintly. "I remember being your age." "Were you always rich?" she asked. Victor laughed softly. "No." He looked toward the reactor again. "I grew up in a small town where the biggest machine anyone owned was a tractor." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "My grandpa liked tractors." Victor leaned back in his chair. Your grandfather sounds like a very wise man." Lily looked at the floor. "He used to say machines are honest." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Honest?" "They tell you exactly what's wrong," Lily explained. "You just have to listen long enough." Victor nodded slowly. "That might be the best engineering advice I've ever heard." Across the room, Dr. Naomi Carter approached them with a tablet in her hands. "You should see this," she said. Victor stood. "What is it, Doctor?" Carter turned the tablet so he could see the screen. The reactor's overnight performance data scrolled across several graphs. Thermal stability, perfect. Magnetic containment, stable. Vibration levels, dramatically reduced. The copper sleeve solution didn't just stop the crack problem, she explained. It improved overall resonance balance. Victor studied the graphs. "How much improvement?" 8% efficiency increase. Victor whistled softly. "That's enormous." "Doctor." Carter nodded. "The investors will love it." Victor glanced toward Lily again. "She didn't just save the project." Dr. Carter smiled faintly. "She made it better." Victor walked toward the reactor floor again. Engineers moved aside respectfully as he approached. He rested a hand on the cool titanium surface of the machine. 10 years of work, hundreds of people, billions of dollars. And the breakthrough had come from an 11-year-old girl who simply listened to a sound everyone else ignored. Victor turned back toward Lily. "You know something interesting," he said. "What?" Victor gestured toward the reactor. "Most of the people in this building spent their entire careers studying machines like that." Lily looked at the reactor. "They forgot to listen." Victor smiled. "Yes." Across the room, Eleanor slowly woke. She blinked in confusion and momentarily unsure where she was. Then she saw Lily sitting beside Victor. Eleanor quickly stood. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I must have fallen asleep." Victor shook his head. "You deserved the rest." Elena looked around the lab, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened. "I still don't understand why you're being so kind to us." Victor looked toward the photograph of the damaged bomber again, then back to Lily. "Because your family once saved mine." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Oh, but that was a long time ago." Victor smiled gently. "Some debts don't expire." Just then, a technician approached Victor. "Sir, the board members are arriving in 30 minutes. Victor sighed. "Of course they are." Dr. Carter chuckled. "They'll want explanations." Victor looked toward Lily one more time. "They'll get them." He paused. "But first, I think there's something more important we should discuss." Lily tilted her head. "What?" Victor smiled. "Well," he said, glancing toward the silent reactor, "now that you've saved my company—" He folded his arms thoughtfully. "The question is, what we're going to do with the future you just built." 30 minutes later, the Orion Dynamics boardroom was full. Sunlight poured through the tall glass windows overlooking the research campus. The long conference table, usually a battlefield of financial reports, contracts, and tense negotiations, felt strangely different that morning. Victor Langford stood at the head of the table. Around him sat 12 board members, several senior engineers, and Dr. Naomi Carter. Most of them had arrived expecting a crisis briefing. Instead, they were staring at the reactor performance charts projected across the wall. One of the board members leaned forward slowly. "You're telling us the Helios reactor is now stable?" Dr. Carter nodded. "Completely stable." She gestured to the efficiency graph. "In fact, the design is now 8% more efficient than the original model." Another board member frowned. "That's impossible." Victor smiled slightly. "It's unlikely." He paused. "But it's also true." The board members exchanged confused looks. Finally, one of them asked the obvious question. "So who solved the problem?" Victor glanced toward the door. "Someone you probably wouldn't expect." The door opened. Eleanor Cruz stepped inside nervously, holding Lily's hand. The room fell silent. Several executives looked confused. Victor walked toward them. "This," he said calmly, "is Lily Cruz." The board members waited. Victor continued. "Last night she discovered the vibration anomaly in the reactor core." A man near the far end of the table blinked. "She's 11. Victor nodded. "Yes." Another board member leaned back. "You're serious." Victor looked toward Dr. Carter. "Show them the acoustic data." "Doctor, our diagnostic software as background noise," she explained. She glanced at Lily. But she heard it. The boardroom remained quiet. Victor turned back toward the table. "Lily also proposed the copper dampening sleeve that stabilized the resonance cascade." Another long silence followed. Finally, one of the older board members chuckled softly. "Well," he said, "I suppose we should all update our hiring policies." A few people laughed quietly. But Victor didn't. He looked toward Lily again. Last night, I made a promise. He walked to the center of the room. I told her that anyone who solved the reactor problem would receive $100 million. Several board members straightened in their chairs. Victor raised a hand before anyone could object. "Oh, the trust fund paperwork is already being prepared." The chairman of the board looked surprised. "You're serious?" Victor nodded. "I keep my word." The room slowly relaxed again. Finally, the chairman smiled. "Well," he said, glancing toward Lily, "it appears Orion Dynamics has just made the smartest investment in its history." Lily looked slightly confused by the attention. She leaned closer to her mother and whispered something. Victor noticed. "What did you ask?" he said gently. Lily looked up. "I asked if the machine will help people." Victor paused. Then he smiled. "Yes." He gestured toward the reactor model displayed on the screen. "If Helios works the way we expect, it could power entire cities with clean energy." Lily thought about that. Then she nodded once. "Good." Victor folded his arms thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "most people spend their lives trying to prove they're the smartest person in the room." He looked around the boardroom. "But last night reminded me of something important." Everyone waited. Victor glanced at Lily again. "The future doesn't belong to the loudest voices." He paused. "It belongs to the people who are quiet enough to hear what everyone else misses." Outside the boardroom windows, the morning sun climbed higher over the Orion campus. Engineers moved between buildings. Technicians prepared the reactor for its next round of testing. The world continued turning. But inside the room, as something had changed. A billionaire had learned humility. A company had rediscovered curiosity. And an 11-year-old girl who listened carefully to machines had just opened the door to a future no one else had been able to hear. Victor looked toward Lily one final time. "Tell me something," he said. "What?" "Do you still want to learn how machines work?" Lily smiled slightly. "I already do." Victor nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "Oh, I suppose you do." And somewhere deep inside the Orion Dynamics facility, the Helios reactor waited quietly. No longer a mystery, no longer a failure, but a reminder that sometimes the greatest discoveries begin not with brilliant equations, but with a child who simply listens to the world long enough to hear the truth.